Nobody really tells buyers how much waiting is involved when buying a home. Honestly, the process feels like small bursts of excitement followed by long periods of waiting. Welcome back, guys, to another episode of Closing the Deal. I am one of your hosts, Zach Dixon, and sitting across from me today is, of course, my co-host, Sam Enright. And today we are talking about one of the most interesting and unexpected parts of buying a home, and that is the waiting that goes into it. A lot of buyers expect the process to be a lot of fireworks, a lot going on all the time, but in all reality, there is a lot of periods and a lot of downtime and a lot of periods of waiting as a whole throughout the entire process, whether that's, when you get started getting pre-approved, going out to see properties, waiting to see properties come on the market that you would like to see. And then, of course, when you get into the in-contract period as well. Think today's episode coincides really, really well with last week's episode. Having the emotional attachment and being really, really excited for closing day. Again, there is just a lot of downtime and some time to have, to yourself to think about the process as a whole. So yeah, super excited for today's episode. Sam, how are you feeling this morning?
Feeling good, man. Definitely love what you said there. I do think that honestly, we've kind of had a theme at the beginning part of this year, which is obviously just kind of going in more depth onto the emotional sides of buying and a lot of the things that go into it, while also, giving some practical information when it comes to buying a home and the realities of what that actually looks like from a time standpoint, a waiting standpoint. So definitely feel like this is a good episode to put in here and just bring a little bit more awareness to how much waiting actually goes into this process. Because like you said, I think a lot of people, if you ask them if they never bought a home before, if you picked them up on the street and you asked them and say, hey, how quickly or how much fireworks do you think are in a home buying process? They would be like, oh, probably a lot. And they probably would discount how much time is actually spent waiting.
For sure. And that's certainly not discounting the fact that there are fireworks. There is absolutely those that go into the process. But there's just a lot of moments where you're, waiting for updates, waiting for answers, waiting just for the next kind of step to happen in the process. And really, that's all you can do as the home buyer is just, wait. And it can be a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? Just monotonous. A little bit monotonous when you get into the in-contract process. But again, that probably just ties a little bit back into our episode from last week. And that's probably when you allow your mind to wander a little bit and start to get excited and start to plan out your furniture and do all of those things. So just trying to coincide both episodes here because I think that they flow really well all in all together. So
yeah, for sure. I mean, you made a good point there. Sometimes I think in the waiting process, we feel like there's something we should be doing. There's something that, what I'm just sitting here just waiting. Like there's gotta be something I should be doing to, to help, expedite the process. And, sometimes, lending and those sort of things can feel out of your control a bit. And, I think sometimes we try to focus on things we can control. So people start making these plans for, what they're going to do when they own the home and, getting all excited and getting furniture purchased and all these different plans that they have, new paint colors, all this before they move in. So definitely believe they both coincide very well with each other and just bringing a little bit more awareness to how much actually goes into this process and how much waiting there actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. So getting started in today's episode with our first segment, just something that I mentioned here in the intro. The waiting really starts earlier than people think and kind of what we've been just talking about in the immediate previous right here. Waiting, it begins when you're waiting for the right home that you want to make an offer on. The waiting begins when you're waiting for listings to come on the market that you want to actually go see in person. Waiting is waiting for the price drops that may happen throughout the process as well. You go to see a property, you really like it, but you determine that it is maybe priced just a little bit too high, and you wait to see if it comes down a little bit, or if anybody else makes an offer and it goes into contract at all. And then another big one is going to be just waiting for responses from sellers when you do decide that you want to make an offer on a property. Again, when you make an offer, typically you're going to have an offer deadline. So you will have, a baseline of when you'll be waiting to or towards, when you'll be waiting towards. But ultimately there is still going to be a lull period in between submitting that offer and getting an acceptance or a denial from the seller. Most typically are not going to send an offer on with an offer deadline of an hour later or 2 hours later. That's just not very, very good business done as a whole. So I think that it just when we start to talk about waiting and we start to talk about downtime and processes in the home buying journey, your first thought is ultimately going towards when you're in contract and going through all the steps that is required for that. But waiting begins a lot earlier than that. We've had clients that take, months, years to find a property that they are ready to, offer on. It's a very personalized process, all in all, from before acceptance and after acceptance. And so you just have to kind of be prepared for that as soon as you get that pre-approval letter in your hands, that you're going to be probably waiting a little bit. It's not very often that that we see home buyers, the first property that they see, they make an offer, it gets accepted, and boom, they're in contract and now moving towards that closing date. Just not a very realistic thought. And so I think a good, preceding thought as soon as you get that pre-approval letter in your hand is to know that you're probably going to be waiting a little bit. It's going to be a month's process, a week's process, not a day's process.
Yeah, for sure. And you also brought up a good point there that, before we're even getting into looking for homes is the pre-approval process. Sometimes that can require some waiting as well. I will just say, honestly, in what I've experienced in the last few years, very few people have income that is just so straightforward that we literally take a look at pay stubs and W-2s and call it a day. A lot of people work different types of jobs, and I don't know if that's employer based. I don't know what it is, but we have a lot of variable income and a lot of different things that require us to get a little bit more information on the forefront to make sure that we're properly qualifying you for a home before we send you out looking. So I know sometimes that process can take a couple of days depending on how quick you get your documentation over. We've had pre-approvals that take a week, depending on if we need to get in touch with the employer and get further verification of income and those sort of things. So it can very much be a waiting game even before you start looking for homes. It's just, you have, like you said, these small bursts where you submit your application, you submit your docs. And so it's like this very hot and heavy thing in the beginning. And then the lender calls and says, hey, we need a little bit more information. Okay, it's going to take, maybe 48, 72 hours to hear back from, the employer or whatever the case may be. And so now there's 2 or 3 days where it's kind of just a lull period, just waiting. And so that's more and more common these days, from what I've seen, at least recently. So just another thing to, add as a little caveat into there before you even start looking at homes, that there's probably going to be some time that you spend waiting before you get your pre-approval as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good points there for sure. Yeah, it's just there's a lot more that goes into the process than people think, and especially first-time home buyers think, all in all. So taking us into our next segment here of the episode, it's just I wanted to touch on a little bit the emotional roller coaster that there is of waiting as a whole. I've seen this time and time and time again with clients. There is so much excitement after seeing a property that immediately you want to make an offer on when you decide that you walk out of the house, and you just have so much excitement, so much built up, probably angst from probably just the showings previous that didn't go so well, and all of the process going into that, the waiting that has happened to find this home that you want to make an offer on. And typically, which is kind of funny, typically my response to those people when they feel so vindicated and feel so excited is to just wait a little bit longer. Give yourself at least 6 hours to go home and just sit on it for just a second. You know what I mean? Depending on the situation, if there's not an offer deadline already in place, just give yourself a little bit of time and wait to see if you still feel this way, 6, 12, 24 hours after the showing. Because again, that can just, if you don't feel that way that soon after the showing, and you or have already changed your mind, ultimately that property is not for you. You're not ready to make an offer on that property. And obviously this is market dependent and kind of, market condition dependent as well, just depending on what your market is like. And if you're in a multi-offer situation, obviously you're probably going to have to act a little bit sooner than you would if you were not in a multi-offer situation. But again, typically speaking, if you are in a multi-offer situation, you're going to have a deadline more than likely at least 24 hours out from what your original showing was. So you can take a little bit of time and take a waiting period to make sure that you still feel this excitement about this property and still want to move forward as a whole. Another one that I've experienced time and time again with clients, and especially in multi-offer situations, is anxiety after submitting the offer. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten texts from clients after we've submitted an offer asking if I've heard anything about their offer yet. Unfortunately, I have not. As soon as I hear something, I will let you know. I promise you on that. But again, it's just the anxiety of waiting for a response is a very, very real feeling, and something that is vindicated. You should feel vindicated in that, because ultimately you care and you feel a little bit of an emotional attachment to this offer and to this property. But again, you just have to accept the fact that you're not going to get a response right away. Typically in a multi-offer situation, the agent and the seller have to review all the offers that they have in hand. They have to make sure that they're making the best decision for themselves. They're doing all of the due diligence that they possibly can to make that best decision for themselves. And typically that's not going to happen in an hour time frame or 2 hour time frame. They're going to take the time that they absolutely need to make it happen. And make the best decision for themselves. So I understand the anxiety that may go into that, but I think it's something that you kind of have to just reshift the mindset, reshift the mind frame, to make sure that you're aware that this is going to take a little bit of time, and there is going to be a waiting period with it as a whole. So the next couple of things, just waiting for updates and checking your phone constantly, waiting for an update from your agent. Again, it goes back to the same exact thing. Just knowing that when you submit an offer and when you are ready to get hopefully that acceptance to your phone, it's not going to be an instantaneous thing. I know that we've talked about it so many times in our content. We live in an instant gratification society. People want things as soon as they want them, and they want them now. Again, that's just not going to be the case in the home buying journey, really, in any capacity, whether it's starting with the pre-approval process, going through the home search, making an offer, and into the in-contract process. Ultimately, this is, again, a weeks, months-long process. You're not going to be getting this done in days, so it's absolutely not going to be an instant gratification, and really just need to shift the mindset a little bit to make sure that we're aware of that and we're accepting of that as a whole.
Yeah. Great points there. That emotional weight of all that waiting can definitely feel very heavy. And sometimes it feels like nothing is happening while everything is happening emotionally inside. Right. So it's this counterbalance of wanting all of these things to kind of put your mind at ease, and then understanding that process doesn't necessarily work like that, unfortunately, just because of the nature of the business and the way that it works, and how long, it normally does take, when you're a seller and you're fielding multiple offers and you're considering, much like you, the buyer, considering what house to buy, considering what factors go into that and what, you want to put an offer on, a seller also has these things into consideration as well. What are we purchase, what's the purchase price for? What is our proceeds going to be? What is the timeline going to look like? Does this coincide with what we want? And so there's decisions on their end as well. So, I know sometimes we have a tendency in life to kind of look at only what's going on internally and look at what's going on inside of our small circle and not realize that there's other external factors, right? So you have a human being on the other end who is also making a decision that is what is best suited for them as well. So that has to be taken into account when you are submitting offers and going through that emotional phase, is just taking a step back and saying, hey, they also have a decision to make. They also have, factors to consider. And that's not something, much like Zach said, hey, take some time to think about, whether or not this is the right home for you, whether you want to put an offer in, they need to sit back and think whether or not this is the right offer to accept. And is this the right thing based on what their goals are and what they're looking to do as well?
Absolutely. Great points there, brother. We're all human. And again, we want to make, we ultimately just need to make the best decision for ourselves. Like that's where it boils down to. And it takes time. There's going to be waiting that is involved in that. Just got to make sure that you're fully aware of that and not kind of just glossing over that fact as a whole. So,
yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, that takes us kind of into, obviously that's the pre, right? The pre-contract, everything before that, you get pre-approved, you go and look at a home. And now, this is another thing I think is the in-contract process, right? And how buyers expect this to move at a lightning fast speed. And in some cases it does, in other cases it does not. There's going to be items in which require time. And one of those things kicking it off is the inspection period, right? So, normally, and I don't know what the average is, Zach, I mean, maybe 3 to 7 days or 3 to 5 days for an inspection period.
probably a week. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah. So, I mean, you have that time, right? You got to get in contact with an inspector, get something on the schedule. I'm sure if they're a really good inspector, they're probably not available the very next day. You're going to have to get something on the schedule that's maybe a couple of days out if they're busy, you know what I mean? So, there's that waiting period of, okay, well, we got the contract. Now we need an inspection. Okay, perfect. Inspector can't be out there for 72 hours. So now you're sitting here, you're waiting for 3 days for them to get out, for them to go through, for you to get that report back. And so, yes, in the grand scheme of things, 3 days can feel, or 3 days is not a lot of time, right? But in this micro situation where you're, have a 30-day rush period where you're trying to buy a home, that can feel like a very long time to just kind of sit and just wait for no updates, right? And so, obviously on the lending side, things are already starting to flow. You're going to get your disclosures, you're going to get that part of the process started, but you're still waiting for the inspection. And then comes the appraisal, right? Normally in most situations, we are waiting for the inspection to come back, for that to be reviewed with you, your agent, to make sure that everything looks good, whether there's a request for remedy period, what does that look like? You're sending this over to the seller, then they have a specific amount of time they need before they respond, so what, another day or two there potentially that you're kind of sitting in limbo waiting to hear back. And then obviously you go into the appraisal side of the process. That's, easily 7 to 10 days to get the appraiser out there, have them type up the report, get the report back to us. And, that's another situation where right now, like we have a VA deal where the appraisal's been ordered and we've been waiting for 10 business days and still don't have it back. So, normally when I say 7 to 10 days, I truly mean 7 to 10 days, not business days. But VA is kind of a different animal sometimes when it comes to that. And sometimes the waiting periods are longer. So it's just one of those things where I'm sure as a client, you can feel like, I'm in the dark. What is going on? Where is my appraisal? And all these different things, right? But we're talking about third-party people, for the VA. They have their appraiser panels. You submit it to them and they determine who it goes to, and they build their own timelines in and everything. So, realistically, an appraiser can take a little bit more time with a VA appraisal because of their rules. So, again, there are things happening on the back end in this. You are still moving forward with your financing, the loans going through the processing, going through underwriting and that sort of thing. But when we're talking about these major milestones, right, these things, we know that a lot of deals are contingent upon inspections and appraisals. So when those, need to be in and need to come back in a favorable manner in order for this deal to move forward, that can feel like a very long waiting game. When you're waiting for that information. So, and then obviously underwriting, most underwriting teams, I would say at this point, I mean, I can't speak for other companies, but, my general thought is, you're 48, 72 hours on that. So 2 to 3 days until you hear back from initial underwriting. So it's not an overly long wait, but when you start to compound these things, when you're waiting 3 days for your underwriting, when you're waiting 7 days for your appraisal, there's going to be no updates for a few days there, right? It's just going to kind of be, hey, we're just waiting. And once we get the next information, I promise you, we're going to reach out. We're going to let you know. So it's just kind of that balancing act of understanding that some of these things do take time and that they're not just very, very quick parts of the process. And there is a natural progression for how these things work. And then you get title work involved in that as well. So obviously we're covering a lot of third party things in here, inspections, appraisals, title work, again, based on other companies and other people that are involved in the transaction, that, we don't necessarily have direct control over how quickly they move and how quickly they get things back. Title work, I've seen that take anywhere from 10 to 21 days, just depending. I've seen it take longer, surprisingly enough. But normally I would say on average, you're waiting about 14 days for title work to come back. So that could be another thing that feels, very monotonous. You're just day over day waiting, haven't heard anything, what's going on. And, then you start to play all these ideas in your head of things that could potentially be going on. And that's ultimately the reason for the episode, is to let you guys know that this is natural. If you don't hear back, if your lender says, hey, we don't have title work back, it's not, hey, there's a problem, this is a red flag. It's, hey, this is just the natural progression of how, things go. And then, finally, obviously clear to close, right? So you get all your items, you submit it back. Sometimes clear to closes can take a little bit of additional time. In the previous episode, we talked about a client who had already made plans and bought all these items and all this stuff for, his closing. And once he gets, into the home and all these things, right? And it's like, but we don't have the clear to close yet. And sometimes there's things that pop up. Sometimes there's things that are talked about and change. And, we have to pivot and we have to make it work in whatever manner that we can. And it's just, there's just a lot of unknown variables. And sometimes that stuff can, require a little bit more additional time.
Great section there. Honestly, you touched on a lot of information, a lot of good points. And again, like we mentioned kind of in the intro, this is probably where the most people's head goes to when you talk about waiting, is once you get into contract. You're just going to have some down periods, some true just downtime. And I think that buyers don't usually realize how many just downtime points there are and things that are happening really behind the scenes until they actually go through the process as a whole. And obviously that's the ultimate goal of today's episode, is to try and kind of shed some light on that for, people that have not gone through the process. But I think that, like you mentioned, there's something to be said for all of those things, about your team surrounding you. Even if there is no update, the communication levels that your team is having with you, is probably what's going to separate this process to make it from a bad waiting process to a good waiting process. If your agent is communicating to you about inspection issues or things that are going on with a request to remedy, or if there's nothing going on on this very specific day, that's better than hearing no words. You know what I mean? Or
Yeah.
if there's something, your lender's communicating to you about the appraisal, we expect it to be back on Friday. A Friday comes and we still don't have it, just your lender updating you that we don't have it yet. We'll follow up on that. Like, that's better than hearing no words. Or, a lot of title companies nowadays will give you a portal for home buyers, and they'll update you step by step on where they are in their process. And so I think it just goes back to, in those waiting periods, having a good team that is communicating solidly with you as the home buyer, even if there is nothing happening, even if they have no news. That's better than, just no words at all being said, especially as a first-time home buyer, I would say.
No, for sure. I mean, I can not speak for, again, can't speak for every company out there, but, on average, I would say our clients hear from us at least twice a week, no matter what, even if there is no updates, or we don't have something. Obviously we're only as good as the information that we have, so in your appraisal example, right, like I can jump into our portal, I can see when an appraiser is supposed to return the report, I can see any notes or anything that they do, and ultimately I can reach out for updates. But I'm only as good as the information that I'm given. So if an appraiser says they're going to have it back in by this date and they don't, ultimately I can communicate that still and let you know, hey, we're supposed to have it, we don't have it. It could just very well be the way that the business has gone. Or, maybe, we had a situation the other day where there was no key in the lockbox when the appraiser went out to the property. So that caused a delay for him. He traveled all the way there and couldn't get into the home. So he had to reschedule and go back out a different day because there was no access for him to be able to get into the home. So, there's these kind of quirky one-off things that can happen. And ultimately, picked up the phone, called the buyer. Hey, just want to let you know, appraisal is supposed to be in this date. Couldn't get access. It's probably going to be an extra day or two. And lo and behold, it was an extra day or two, but the report did come in and we got it all taken care of. And so it's just like Zach said, those open lines of communication of just letting people know, like, hey, this is where we stand. This is where things are at. And trying to get that to you guys at least twice a week. Even if there is nothing going on, and just letting you know, hey, this is where we're at. And we are still on top of things. We are still thinking about you. We'll get you guys updates as soon as we have them.
For sure. And that kind of takes us into the next segment of the episode and why waiting feels so heavy. If you don't have those open lines of communication and you're not hearing anything at all, the first thing I think people are going towards is something's going wrong. You're afraid that we have something going wrong. There's, something is happening on the back end that we're not aware of and we have no control over it, and something is happening. And so I think that it's just, having those lines of communication allows you as the buyer to feel comfortable and confident that there is something going on, but you're aware of it, and and steps are being taken to correct it, or whatever it may be. Steps are being done, and it will be done in a timely fashion, whatever it is. And so I think just another reason why waiting feels so heavy is, being emotionally invested. And that's something we just touched on in last week's episode, but feeling so ready to move into this home or starting to make plans, imagining your life there, that is going to, again, make your waiting period just feel even longer. I remember as a kid, like, my parents would tell me that time would move faster if you don't pay attention to it. And so to try and make time move slower, I would literally just stare at the clock. And it's like, it's the same example. Like when you have nothing going on, and you're just so ready for this, day to come, the closing day, and to be closed, time is going to move unbelievably slow, even though it's moving at the same exact rate it always does. It's just something that goes on in our head when we're so emotionally attached to, something at the end of the road there. And so I think it's just, again, taking a step back, like we mentioned in last week's episode, and kind of, detaching a little bit from that day and realizing that we have steps and processes in place to get to that day for a reason. And we just need to let those steps and processes happen as a whole. And so I think just all of those things kind of go into why waiting just feels heavy, feels like so long of time, even though, again, time moves at the same exact speed all day, every single day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. But again, it just feels longer when we're emotionally invested or we're not hearing anything.
Yeah, 100%, man. I know I've experienced that in my own life. And, it can, when you're very emotionally invested in something, that waiting period can feel very, very heavy on you. And our brains are funny in the way that they work, in the way that they can play tricks on us and get us to overthink situations. And, that's a whole different topic of conversation, but, it is prevalent obviously here. It just, yeah, sometimes you gotta just understand that there is a natural process to this, and it happens for most people. Your situation when buying a home is not going to be that fairly different from somebody else's, right? There's still going to be waiting periods. It's not necessarily just you, it's across the board, and there's a natural way that it happens. And obviously, like Zach talked about, our job is to communicate that with you guys and make sure that you understand that way, that can help at least alleviate some of that off your chest and off your shoulders.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And just kind of wrapping up, I know that we talked about it already, but what really helps buyers through that heavy waiting process is just having realistic expectations and detaching from the unrealistic expectations that we might have. Obviously, when you have just an emotional investment, sometimes that's going to come with unrealistic expectations as a whole as well. And a good example would be expecting an offer acceptance or denial within an hour of sending it, or closing within 3 weeks or 2 weeks or whatever it may be. All of those things are very unrealistic, and so you have to make sure that you're kind of detaching yourself from that, and having just patience in the process, like we mentioned. And then another big one again is going to be the communication. Open lines of communication, like we mentioned, from your team is going to be so much better and so much better of an experience for you as a home buyer throughout the process than just not hearing anything, even if nothing is going on. Again, just having the message of, I have no news for you today, I'll keep you updated as I hear more, is so much better than hearing absolutely nothing. And I can wholeheartedly attest to that on all fronts. And so you just have to make sure that you're well aware that waiting doesn't always mean that something is wrong. It doesn't mean that. You're just taking the natural progression and steps of the process in stride and making sure that everything is just continuing on that process and on that plan.
Love it. I love it, brother. Yeah. I mean, it's a great point. And, I just, guys, closing us up here, it's funny because, buying a home it's just not always about these exciting back-to-back moments, right? And so, just from the very beginning, reaching out to your lender, wanting to get a pre-approval, looking at different homes, going through the contract process, there is going to be, like we talked about in the very beginning, short bursts of exciting things. And then obviously from there's going to be some waiting involved. And obviously with that waiting does come uncertainty and questions and different emotions that you're feeling internally. The goal of this episode is to obviously hopefully help with that. If you start the home buying journey and understanding that these are just natural parts of it, but obviously having a good team around you is going to help as well when you have a real estate agent and when you have a lender who are steadfast in communication and keeping you up to date with things and reassuring you that everything that is going on is very natural and there is nothing out of the ordinary for you specifically. I think that can create some reassurance and understanding that this is just a natural part of the process. And ultimately, once you get the keys, that is going to become part of the story.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. The journey to the end goal is just as fun as the end goal itself. Like, you remember the journey just as much as achieving that end goal. You really do. And in any aspect, I like to use the vacation example. Honestly, when you book a vacation, part of the fun of the vacation is the anticipation, waiting for that vacation to come, that 6, 7, 8 months in the interim between that, like just having that anticipation, building and building and building is truly a part of the journey and a part of the fun that you experience as a whole in the journey itself. So couldn't have said it better myself. Well, guys, that is all that we have for today's episode. Again, guys, hopefully you found some value and enjoyed today's episode as a whole. Again, we drop episodes every Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern time. Video form on YouTube, audio form on Apple Podcasts and Spotify Podcasts. Again, drop 3 reels a week on all of the social media platforms as well as YouTube Shorts. Genuinely appreciate all of the support that we've been getting. Enjoy seeing everybody comment on our stuff and seeing the stories, come along as well from our specific episodes and people relating to the stuff that we're talking about. Again, it's all for home buyers and educating you guys and hopefully, giving you guys some knowledge as you get started on the home buying journey as well. So hopefully you guys enjoyed today's episode again, and we will see you guys on the next one.